I thought it was about time that I featured the star of the show, Magnus Carlsen, in one of my play of the days. He seems to be getting into gear after, well, a quiet start to the Olympiad. Somehow the media interest, well, I wouldn't say it's died down around him, but it's calming down, and probably that enables him to concentrate a bit better in his games. Anyway, I'd like to look at his victory over Radoslav Wojtaszek from round 4. And this was really wonderful game. Well, let's plunge straight in. So Carlsen with the white pieces. Now, tricky playing against Wojtaszek. Wojtaszek has actually been a second of Anand's over the last few years. So Wojtaszek is very well known as being theoretically well prepared, but also as an extremely solid competitor. So you see that Carlsen has selected the Closed Sicilian. Now, this doesn't have, I wouldn't say a brilliant theoretical reputation, but it's a way of just bringing the pieces into the game, and it's typical of the kind of pragmatic approach that Carlsen takes to the openings. And this knight on h3, a little bit unusual, leaving room for the f-pawn to advance. Wojtaszek has played in quite a standard way. This is a so-called Botvinnik system, when you put the pawns here, and gives black control over the centre with this nice knight on d4. So white castles and castles, queen d2. So this is often very useful to line up queen and bishop on this diagonal. But actually, you know, black is very solid here. I know this looks like an ambitious attacking setup for white, but actually it's not such a big deal. And here, well, a couple of moves I like for black. Rook b8 I think is sensible to bring the rook off this diagonal. But also, instead, bishop g4 is also a nice move, because if the knight comes back, then bishop f3, I think it's nice to exchange off these bishops. But Wojtaszek selected bishop d7. I find that move slightly odd. I don't think it's a great square for the bishop. Knight d1. Good move from Carlsen. Of course, this knight on d4 is so well placed, and white really needs to drive it away. Of course, the knight is not so great on the back rank, but okay, that's the disadvantage. It takes time. Queen c8. I think I prefer b6 here, and the point of this move is that after the knight is driven back, you can see that the c5 pawn has been protected, so that after pawn takes pawn, black can still recapture here because c5 is protected. I'm not saying that white should do that, but I think this would be you know, a pretty solid way for black to play. Queen c8, I'm not sure. I think that helps white to a certain extent, because this knight wants to be recycled anyway, and white takes control over here. So the knight obviously protects the knight on h3. So the knights drop back, and c3 anyway. And here again, I like b6 to protect this pawn on c5. But instead b5, and I feel this pawn isn't doing a huge amount. I know sometimes it's nice to advance the pawn to b4 to open up lines, but here I feel that, well, what happens now? Here's the point. After pawn takes pawn takes is not possible because c5 is on prise. So black has to recapture with the knight, and now you can see that white has greater control over the centre. Now white can't play, or shouldn't play, d4 straight away, because then knight c4 hits queen and bishop. But white can take his time. Bishop h6, good move. Always good to exchange off this bishop, weakens the king, and weakens black's control over the centre as well. Carlsen exchanged and brought this knight from the side of the board to an excellent square. Not only looking at nice square d5, but you never know, sometimes might be able to attack black's king. Queen d8 to cover some squares. Rook covers these dark squares on the king's side, but also maybe comes to b6. I didn't really like the queen on c8 actually. I think that was a mistaken plan. Rook d1. So Carlsen just building slowly. He doesn't want to rush this one. Very typical. He's just seeing what happens first. And now actually white could play d4 and put the queen on e2, but Carlsen doesn't want to give anything away. First of all, he moves his queen to the side. I think it's a clever idea. So it's preempting knight c4 and perhaps keeping this one in reserve, but basically keeping his options open. And it's not clear exactly what black is going to play here. Of course, if queen b6, then the knight comes to d5. What is black's plan here? And it's interesting. I think black's best is to play knight e7 to cover the d5 square. Now, perhaps a little bit passive, but I think better than the move Wojtaszek played. h5 I don't like. I understand he's trying to perhaps exchange knights with knight g4, something like this, or maybe bishop g4, I don't know. But this weakens the king side, there's no doubt about it. This pawn on h5 gives white something to bite on. Let's see how this works out in practice. So Carlsen now pushed, he's ready. The knight gets pushed from its central square. This is the problem. If he had a pawn on e5, this wouldn't be happening, but you can see that white, with these two central pawns, has decent control in the centre. h3. So black has succeeded in exchanging knights, but actually, in a sense, it helps white's position too, because he now has very well coordinated pieces. This knight looks good here, and this pawn on h5, it feels like it's weakened black's king position. Knight e7, covering d5. Now, very simple manoeuvre from Carlsen. He just takes control from this moment on. He played rook d3, swinging across to the f file. Very straightforward. What a powerhouse, looking at the f7 square. So, there could even be a threat already just to sacrifice a piece with knight h5 and crash in. So queen e8 covers the pawn again. Okay, so how does white make progress now? Well, this move I really like, g4, so Carlsen's starting to roll on the king side. This can't be taken, by the way. Let's have a look at this. Now we can see that the lines would open up to black's king if the bishop drops back. Then obviously knight h5 and either queen or knight then land on f6, and that's fatal. So let's say queen d7 to protect the bishop. But then bishop h3, excellent move. Again, if the bishop is taken, then knight h5 is killing. And f5, d5, this is a great idea, and the knight hops into e6 and black's position collapses. Very, very simple. Wojtaszek tried bishop b5. Rook came across. And now again, Carlsen just rolls on. With this pawn on g5, that is going to provide support for white's pieces on f6 or h6. If, let's say, knight g8, so the queen now threatens the pawn on g5, then just queen h4, and you can see white has opened the h-file, and that's going to be the end of that. Probably black is lost at this point. It's very interesting. I mean, there are various ways to go here. I think rook h3 is probably possible, but bishop h3 it's such an elegant way to play the game. The bishop threatens the rook. The rook moves to the side, and now bishop e6. When I was looking at this game yesterday with Garry Kasparov, nice bit of name dropping there, and he was very impressed with this manoeuvre. He really liked it. And, he said, Carlsen's games often have this elegance to them. Kasparov was really impressed by this. If the bishop is taken, then the knight checks and the rook hangs, so that can't be done. But now what's the point of this maneuver? Well, of course, there's extra pressure on f7. It also clears the h-file, so these pieces can swing over a little easier as well. Okay, the bishop dropped back to protect f7. And now there are various ways to win, but typically for Carlsen, he selected the simplest way, no complications. He exchanged a pair of pieces, and in this position Wojtaszek actually resigned. Well, let's see what the threat is. Let me make a random move for black. Supposing I play a5, random move. Rook h3 threatens queen f6, and if f5, well, here's a nice finish. Rook h7 takes, queen to the h-file, and queen h6 is mate. Well, what a beautiful combination. Black's king caught in the crossfire. Let's go back. So that's the basic threat. So what if we bring the queen over? So rook h3, again threatening queen f6. Well, these are only moves from black. Well, that's another nice move. If this is taken, then once again it's mates on the h-file on h6. And if king f8, then, well, we just continue hounding the king, and f7 is going to collapse here. For example, here, and I think you can see it's really all over. So Wojtaszek's resignation was not premature. It's incredible. You know, if you play through this game, it's only 33 moves long. It seems so simple, and yet Wojtaszek is a 2700 player, the Polish #1 player. Carlsen makes it look so easy.